Welcome to a beginner's intro to Kerbal Space Program. In this series, we're learning the absolute basics of Kerbal Space Program from the point of view of a complete beginner trying out the game for the first time. Let's dive into Episode 3. Welcome back to Kerbal Space Program. This is Episode 3, and what we're going to be doing is bringing you through the process of launching a rocket to orbit and understanding the basics of that. And we're also going to go through the Kerbal engineering process, which is a fun process of trial and error and usually some explosions. So, since the last episode, I spent about 20 minutes or so driving around with a little science car that I'm showing you here, collecting science from the different biome zones that you have in the buildings around the Kerbal Space Center. We discussed that at the end of Episode 2, that's a way to sort of get a little bit of a science boost early on. So I did that, and I got us to this point in the tech tree, where we've unlocked these first, second, and third level technologies, and we've also unlocked fuel systems. Now, there's a couple of these I want to give a special shout out to and talk about why they're important. The flight control technology gives you access to these fins. Those will help you steer rockets as they ascend. That becomes very important once your rockets get big. The aviation technology gives us access to these wheels and these little jet engines. That's what I used to make that little science car to drive around the Kerbal Space Center. So if you decide that you want to use that trick to get the early science boost, get this aviation technology very quickly so that you can get those parts. Also, general construction. General construction is one of the most essential technologies in the entire game, and that is because of two things: these launch clamps and struts. Launch clamps allow you to hold a rocket steady on the launch pad before you launch it, so that it's not resting all of its weight like on the engines directly flush against the ground. That helps you launch rockets like straight up without them wobbling over to the side or just exploding. Kind of important. And these strut connectors, what these allow you to do is connect different parts together structurally, so that, like, if your rocket design isn't perfectly aerodynamic or something, or if it's very tall, these strut connectors will allow you to connect things so that they stay kind of sturdy and they don't wobble around and fly apart and explode. That's very important. Also, researching general construction allows you to use a feature called auto strut, which is very helpful. Let's take a look at something real quick. If you go here into your settings from the escape menu, you want to make sure this advanced tweakables option is turned on. This will allow you to use the auto strut function. Now we'll show you what that's all about in just a moment here. So first thing we're going to want to do to talk about getting something up into orbit, let's build a new little capsule here. And we'll do it very similar to our previous one. We'll get our drogue parachutes. That will open before our main parachute. We'll get our heat shield. Actually, you know what else? Let's demonstrate another very important part. This science box. Now, it's huge and it's kind of awkward, so I'm going to clip that down into the pod a little bit. But that is a very important piece of equipment, and we'll demonstrate why in a few minutes. So we'll do our decoupler again. And a science module. And here's an advanced trick. You're going to notice that when I did the decoupler under that heat shield, it makes this weird, like, checkerboard ring around the outside, and it looks kind of out of place, and it doesn't flush with the sides of the rocket, you can get rid of that. If you click on your decoupler and just move it up a notch, there you go. You can avoid having that little extra ring there. So we're going to do some extra little science parts. Oh, I didn't want that with two of them. Didn't need the symmetry. And it's the X key on your keyboard that controls the symmetry. And or you can click the little circle down there in the bottom left. So we're going to bring this in a little bit, just so it's a little bit more flush. And there's our fuel tank, and we're going to use a smaller engine. And this will be our orbital spacecraft. And it is 13 parts, so we've used about half of our parts on our basic little orbital craft. But just to be safe, I'm also going to add in 2 batteries. And we're going to put those flush on the inside. Now, in order to actually get this into orbit, we're going to have to go through and build ourselves a rocket. Now, this is where the Kerbal engineering process comes into play. If you remember before, in order to get into space at all, we just used a simple solid rocket booster. So we're going to try that and see how it works. And we'll do some fins so that we can steer our rocket going up. How many parts do we have left? We have a bunch. Now I'm also going to demonstrate what the launch clamps do. These launch clamps are staged. You can see here, down in the lower right. They allow you to literally just hold a rocket up off of the ground when you go to launch it. Now, this rocket is not going to get into orbit, but I want to just demonstrate that. So let's call this Orbital 1, even though it's not really going to get there. Now, this is going to be a little bit of an introduction to a concept called delta V. Delta V is an extremely important term and concept in the larger topic of rocketry. The simplest way to explain it is that delta V is a measurement of the potential energy you have to change your velocity. For example, if your rocket has 100 meters per second of delta V, you have enough fuel and engine power to change your speed and go from 0 meters per second to 100 meters per second. So the more delta V allows you to go further and do more and have more of a margin for error while you're sort of, planning and executing your flight. Now, we've got our throttle all the way up. That's only going to matter for that liquid fuel engine up top. We've got our staging checked. We're going to quick save just for good measure. That's the F5 key on the keyboard. And we're going to launch. And here goes our little rocket. Now I have those aerodynamic fins I added. That allows me to steer the rocket a lot easier. Now, a good thing to mention here again, when you're trying to achieve orbit, you want to lean your rocket to the right as you're flying up. And the reason is that's the direction that we're going to be orbiting the planet. And the reason we go this way, we go to the east, is that we're using the rotation of the planet as a little bit of extra horizontal velocity to help us achieve orbit a little bit easier. So, all right, our first stage has ran out of fuel. And if we hit M, we're going to see, all right, that's not quite going to get anywhere. So let's stage into our liquid fuel engine and see how far this can get us. Now remember, it's not enough just to get this into orbit. We have to get this into orbit with a little bit of fuel left over so that we can slow down and do what's called a retrograde burn. Slow down enough to enter the atmosphere and land. So that's very important. So this rocket isn't quite going to be able to get us into any kind of an orbital flight. Yeah, as you can see, this gray line is showing our trajectory. It's not going to get us into anything close to an orbital flight. So we're going to hit the escape key, and we're going to revert flight and revert to vehicle assembly. Now, one of the ways that the technology tree in Kerbal Space Program forces you to research some of the better parts is that these extra fuel tanks are larger and carry more fuel in one part. Now, so here's this fuel tank here, right? We can take one of this one or two of these other ones. They're literally just half the size. But the advantage is this other tank is one single part and only counts as one towards our part count. So that's the advantage there, and that's kind of why that's so important. So we're going to take two of these, and we're going to take a swivel engine, which is a liquid-fueled, gimbaled engine. This will be steerable as the rocket goes up through the air. And we're also going to do a couple of these radial-mounted decouplers, watching our parts count, with some booster engines on the side. And this will be a good opportunity to demonstrate a couple of different concepts. So first, let's bring these down a little bit. Uh-oh, look at that. Our rocket has gone over mass. We have a mass limit because of our launch pad of 18 tons. So that might be a little bit of a problem. Those solid rocket boosters are heavy. So let's switch down to the smaller ones and see if that'll work for us. Okay, that'll work. We're under our parts count, we're under our mass limit. These little rockets aren't going to give us a whole lot of extra thrust, but they'll give us something. Now what we're going to do is we're going to put a nose cone onto these little side boosters, and we're going to use our struts. The strut connectors literally just attach like this, and it's literally just a structural brace that will keep these stable and secure as the rocket goes upwards. You can also right-click on a part and use this feature here, Auto Strut. You can click through that and auto strut to heaviest part, root part, grandparent part, or disabled. With something like this, I would usually auto strut to the grandparent part, but since we have these strut connectors, we don't really have to bother. You can, but it's not essential for this. I'm also going to use 2 launch clamps, since I don't want this whole rocket balancing all of its weight onto that little swivel engine. So let's set up our staging. We're going to do the swivel engine, and those 2 solid rocket boosters and the launch clamps. Then, once the solid rocket boosters burn out, we're going to do the second stage with these decouplers, the radial decouplers, to jettison them. And then our upper stage is going to be what we hope is our orbital spacecraft. So let's see how this works out. Now, because our first stage of this rocket contains a liquid fuel engine, it's going to be very important to make sure that we throttle up right from the start. So you can see down there our throttle is at maximum. We're going to turn on our stability assist. Let's bring up our resources tab and stage our rocket. Now for a flight profile, you want to start to bank once you hit about 100 meters per second. All right, discarding the dead weight of those solid rocket boosters. And your goal... Oh, we're tipping over. Oh no! Oh no! So the reason that happens is if the center of gravity in our rocket is not really ideal. We can sometimes recover from one tip, but ideally you don't want that to happen. But as I was saying, for an ideal flight trajectory, what you want to do is you want to aim for flying about 45 degrees once you hit 300 meters per second. Oh, 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 we're tipping again. Now, that's also something, what you're seeing there. This is also a problem that having some stability fins can help with. However, we don't have enough parts count. So that's a bit of an issue. But let's fly this up just to see what happens. We'll continue this mission and see how far we can get. Now, those couple of tumbles we took there on the way up, due to the aerodynamic instability of our rocket, that cost us a lot of performance, because as we were tumbling, we had excessive drag through the atmosphere that was slowing our rocket down. And it was also throwing our trajectory off quite a bit. So we lost a lot of energy through those tumbles. That's a very bad thing, and definitely something you want to avoid. Alright, so our liquid fuel rocket stage is almost burnt out. We have a really good ascent angle there. However, we're definitely not in orbit just off of that. Let's see what we can get out of our second stage. Now, first thing is, we haven't upgraded our tracking center, so we don't have any idea of how high this altitude really is, remembering that 70,000 meters is the edge of space in Kerbal Space Program. If you upgrade your tracking center, this will give you an apoapsis and periapsis indicator. Sorry, my voice is a little hoarse. I'm kind of sick today. Which will show you what your peak altitude is going to be. So we're just going to fast forward. Okay, we're in space. All right, so we've reached 70,000. That's good. So we've at least gotten into space. Now let's try and burn to the east, steering our rocket to point directly east, and see what we can get out of this second stage. Now I'm going to speed up my time a little bit, but watching my fuel very carefully. Maybe. So this rocket almost gets to orbit. So as it is right here, this is going to be a suborbital space flight, but that's not what we want. So let's revert back to vehicle assembly, or you can just fly that mission out. That's totally fine too. Now, what was holding us back here? What was holding us back, if you remember, was the weight and the parts count. So let's see what we can do about that. If we right-click on our launch pad, we can upgrade it for 50,000, which we can easily afford. And that'll allow us up to 140 tons and a significantly larger sized rocket. So let's definitely do that. How about our vehicle assembly building? We can also upgrade that, but it'll cost us almost all of our money. And that would allow us to have 255 parts. Now, I'm not going to do that for this video, but if you want to, the way to get a little bit of extra funds is just to go through and do some of these contracts. But for now, we're going to live with that 30 part limit, because I've done this before and I know we can get to orbit with 30 parts. It's not a problem. So we're going to get rid of these boosters. We're going to get rid of these launch clamps for now. So let's take larger solid rocket boosters and see what can happen there. Now, another thing that I'm going to do is I'm not going to fire the liquid fuel rocket right from the start. Our first stage is only going to be those solid rocket boosters. Now, we have 23 parts. We could get away with doing more solid rocket boosters, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to put a nose cone, and I'm going to auto strut these to the grandparent part. That will save us 2 parts on our struts. And I'm also going to do 4 fins on the liquid-fueled stage of our rocket. This will help us maintain stability and steer as we go up. We're not using launch clamps on this rocket. But all of the weight is going to be on these solid rocket boosters, which are a little bit more sturdy than this single liquid fuel engine. So we'll save and we'll launch. Okay, we're going to throttle up. Even though our first stage doesn't use the liquid fuel engine, when we stage into it, we want it to already be at maximum throttle. Hit our resources, stage into the solid boosters, and up we go. Now you can see these two solid rocket boosters have more than enough thrust to get our core rocket here off the ground. So that's a pretty good value. Now we're going to want to start to angle sideways a little bit to the east, and we're not going to go too far, again, because we don't want to do that tumble like we had before. Now we're almost out of juice on the solid rocket boosters. Now, I'm not going to be fully 45 degrees yet, because when I jettison these boosters, I don't want them to fall back and hit my rocket and explode. See there? They could have easily fallen back and hit my core rocket and exploded, so I didn't want that. So we've staged into our liquid fuel rocket, we're still gaining speed, and we're steering into that 45 degree angle. And as you can see, we've just started this central burn, and we're already pretty high into the atmosphere. So we got a lot of good value out of those two solid rocket boosters. Those particular boosters, those solid ones we were using, are very inefficient. They're actually not a good value in terms of delta V and thrust relative to their weight. But early on in the game, they can be a good value just in terms of getting some of these, basic missions off of the ground. They're most useful in like radial mounting like that. And if we had 4 of them, we could get pretty far with even just this basic rocket. So we can see there we're getting pretty high. We don't have our apoapsis or periapsis indications, so we don't really know for sure how high that is, but we can guess. We're almost 50,000 meters, and that's definitely more than twice our altitude away, so that's definitely going to get into space. So I have cut my throttle. You don't have to at this point. It's slightly more optimal to do it this way. I'm going to cut my throttle and speed up until I am just out of the atmosphere. Then I'm going to use my throttle again, just inching it up a tiny bit so that I can help steer the rocket. If you look closely, you'll see that the swivel engine has a steerable gimbal mount that'll help you control your direction. And then I'm going to punch it once we're going directly east. And we'll see our flight trajectory there gradually start to increase. And this rocket from this point should have no trouble achieving orbit. And you're going to notice we didn't have any tumbling problems or anything. These aerodynamic fins helped quite a bit in keeping our rocket nice and straight. Now you're going to see I'm angling down a little bit into the dirt. What that's allowing me to do is to help optimize our trajectory here so that our flight path is a little bit more of a circle. Oh, look at that. Look at that. We have just about achieved orbit. But just to be sure, I'm going to turn my throttle all the way down, and I'm going to stage so that we jettison our booster here, and we have our orbital spacecraft left. Now, what I'm going to do to make extra sure that we're actually in an orbit, and that this portion over here, this lower part of our flight path, isn't low enough to get into atmospheric friction, is I'm going to time warp so that we're over here on our highest point, and then I'm going to burn a little bit more just to raise our altitude and circularize our orbit. So we'll use our time slider here in the corner just to get up here. And this doesn't have to be exact. I mean, this early in the game, doing these kind of missions, you can be really sloppy and still be successful. And I'm deliberately not optimizing some of my stuff here just to try and demonstrate that there's margin for error. So you can see I've boosted in the direction I was traveling, and it has raised our altitude over there and circularized our orbit. So we are now definitely in orbit. So congratulations, we have achieved orbit around planet Kerbal. Now let's do some science. We already did the crew report for a suborbital flight, so nothing to see there. We can take temperature, nothing to see there because we already did that in our low orbit. Our barometric pressure, we've already did that in our low orbit. Our mystery goo, we've already done that, but we can get some diminishing returns from it. And we can conduct a material study. We've already done that, but we can get some diminishing returns from it. Now, the reason I'm doing these isn't just for the diminishing returns. I want to demonstrate this part here, the science container. Use this function to collect all. What that'll do is it'll take the scientific data off of these other parts and move them into the science container. That way, when we stage and we jettison all of this extra dead weight when we go in to land our capsule, we can still get the science from these parts even though we're not bringing them with us back down for landing. So that ends up being extremely important. Now, we're going to go into land, and I want to land in the daylight. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to use my time warp again until we're over here on the night side of the planet. Then I'm going to angle my rocket so that I am facing retrograde. Again, that symbol there, the little triple line with the X through it, is your symbol for retrograde. And what that means is that we are facing backwards relative to our direction of travel. And I'm going to punch my throttle until our trajectory is going to dip us down into the atmosphere. Now, I don't have the tracking center upgraded, but the target that you want to go for here, at least that I always use as a very safe estimate, is to get your apsis to about 30,000 meters. That will provide enough atmospheric drag to slow you down for a landing. However, it will not produce so much atmospheric drag that your spacecraft burns up upon re-entry. However, since I don't have that measurement, I have to kind of just try and eyeball this, which is very unreliable. So you may absolutely blow up some space capsules when you try this for the first couple times. That's why you hit F5 to do a quick save, and you can hold down the F9 key to reload it. So that'll be your friend. So I don't need any of the rest of this stuff. We are set on our trajectory to re-enter the atmosphere and land. So I'm going to hit space and stage out of all of that rubbish. Now, one thing I've noticed, my parachute staging is incorrect. Uh-oh. The good news is we can use these little plus and minus keys to adjust our staging mid-flight. That's a very useful thing and something that you should definitely get in the hang of doing early on. So I've taken our two drogue parachutes and moved them into the next stage. And what that'll allow us to do is to slow down a little bit more before our main parachute drops. Now, I'm going to turn off my stability assist for right now, and I'm going to speed up just because we don't need to spend 20 minutes floating around the planet. Once we get to the point where we're starting to get close to entering the atmosphere, I'm going to turn stability assist on for a moment or two, just to orient our capsule so that this heat shield is going to be going head first into the atmosphere and absorbing all of the thermal energy. And we briefly talked about that before, but you're going to notice for a regular re-entry here that this heat shield is going to be getting kind of smoky, and the ablator is going to go down. What ablator is just material that burns up and flakes off of the heat shield to transfer thermal energy away from the spacecraft, just as like debris, so that it doesn't transfer up into our crew capsule here. Now, this re-entry is going to take quite a while, so we can use our time warp to speed this up. You don't have to, but you can. We can also check. Oh, we haven't done a crew report from Kerbin's upper atmosphere, so there's a little bit of extra science. How about that? So as you can see already, our ablator resource is starting to drain. And we're cooking. You can see our velocity here is starting to decrease. It is not yet safe to deploy our drogue parachutes. There's, the icon for them is still bright red, so we don't want that. We can try and deploy them once it gets orange, but I usually wait until it's gray and it's safe. So these will slow us down quite a bit. And it's already safe to deploy our main parachute, but, I'm just going to exercise a little bit of caution here. Okay, so they've slowed us down to a pretty gentle fall. Now, from this point, you can actually right-click on the parachute and cut them. It's a little hard to do when they're wobbling, so we'll take off our time warp. So we don't really need those anymore. We can just fall straight down, and once we get a little bit lower, we'll do our main parachute. Coming down from orbit, I usually do that at around 1,500 meters. There we go, look at that. That's a good safe landing velocity. Now it's going to take a few minutes to float down, so we're going to time warp and speed up. Okay, we have splashed down, and we can recover our vessel. And congratulations, we have just made an orbital spaceflight of the planet Kerbal. Okay, you can see that mission only gave us 39 science, not a lot, but we had already done some of those experiments. We got some funds, that's interesting. Some of them are from recovered parts, and some of them are from our... don't need the alarm clock. Some of them are from our world first milestones. We've achieved orbit and returned to the surface from orbit. That's a quick 50,000. And we completed our contract. So there's a little bit more. Excellent. We can use that to upgrade our vehicle assembly building. So now we can make much larger rockets and much heavier rockets. So that's about all we're going to do for right now. Stay tuned for episode 4, where I'm going to show you how to do a flyby of the moon. As always, thanks for watching.